So my name is Mike Myatt. I'm a program officer at the Water Foundation, and I'm also serving on the board of the new consortium that Wade was describing in his remarks called the California Water Data Consortium that we're building now. And I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today on the Internet of Water. Before I introduce our guests, I just wanted to provide a little context. It's already been mentioned several times looking back to the first data summit, and I was going to do the same. But also thinking about like the state of play at the time. So that was in 2016. I don't remember the exact month, probably about this time, August or September. At that time, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, AB 1755, had passed the legislature and was sitting on the governor's desk awaiting his signature. The Aspen Institute, Duke University, and Redstone Strategy Group had begun convening a dialogue series on water data, so those discussions were starting. The California Data Collaborative had formed as a nonprofit and was in the midst of their first year, looking towards the end of a successful year. I do remember that Wade was the keynote. He had just recently been hired as the executive director of a scrappy organization called the Water Foundation, where I work. So he was responsible for about a dozen people at that time. And we were all able to fit in a classroom in the Stanford Business School. And so now, looking around today, I don't want to get all Trumpian and make it about crowd size, but it's huge numbers. I think that's an indicator, though, of the broad interest in this topic, which is really remarkable when you take something as wonky as water and marry it with something as wonky as data, and to have so many people interested to come and learn and network and talk more about water data. So I've never seen this momentum on a topic so wonky. And we've made a lot of progress in 3 years. So now where we are, AB 1755 has passed, been signed into law, we're well into implementation. It's bringing together stakeholders. Wade described the collaboration and the relationship among the state agencies that are implementing the act. And so that's a great example of agencies coming together and breaking down silos to work together. We have what started as a series of conversations with the Aspen Dialogue Series has turned into now the creation of a national backbone organization called the Internet of Water that we'll hear more about on this panel. We have datathons like what's happening next door today, and hackathons and data challenges that are bringing together students and individuals to sit down and solve problems on water data. We have other states now paying attention. So New Mexico recently, earlier this year, passed their version of the Water Data Act. So a lot of great things are happening. In California, we have a lot of organizations I call C-word organizations, coalitions, collaboratives, consortia, and that can feel confusing to those on the outside and even to some of us on the inside. But I actually think that's a really good thing. This is definitely a more is merrier problem. And though I'm really excited about the opportunity and the momentum that we all have, I'm not, I don't have any false illusions that like this is going to be easy. It's really hard. There's a lot to do. So the more talent and the more innovation and people that want to join this party, I welcome you to that. But it only works with some additional C words of collaboration and coordination and communication. And I really think that that's what the Internet of Water and this new California Water Data Consortium can do to provide that connective tissue to bring this all together. And that's what we'll be talking about today. That's the purpose of this panel. So we're going to get kicked off with Martin first. So Martin Doyle is a professor at Duke University focused on water science and policy and a co-founder of the Internet of Water. In addition to his time in academia, Martin has worked at the Department of Interior, where he focused on infrastructure finance, and at the Corps of Engineers, where he focused on the Clean Water Act and reservoir operations under changing climate. He helped co-convene the Aspen Dialogue Series that spawned the Internet of Water, and is currently the chair of the Board of Advisors for the Internet of Water. He's also an accomplished writer, I brought my personal copy of his book, The Source, which is a history of American rivers. He didn't know I was going to do that, so I don't want you to think like he put me up to that. But I will be asking you to autograph it later today. You should all pick up a copy. I can vouch for it. It's really an excellent book. So, Martin.
So I'm going to have a booth outside with the copies. No. All right, thanks for this. I was joking with Deven before we started that really you need a North Carolina river historian to come to California and talk about data and the internet. So I think that there's a reality that water and data just haven't mixed very well over the past, let's say, centuries, since John Wesley Powell really established the first stream gauge at Lee's Ferry in the Colorado River. We just haven't usually thought about the importance of data. It just hasn't been part of the conversation. And I think that the reality is that in a lot of ways, California is ahead of some of the other states. In a lot of ways, they're behind some of the other states. But in many ways, California has been a policy entrepreneur. The Internet of Water startup team, we are small but mighty. And we also have we've invested fairly significantly in outreach coordinator. And so we're finding that investing in people who actually spend their time and attention in the actual social aspects of building the trust needed to actually start sharing this data and agreeing to adopt certain protocols and all of those types of social types of interactions is something that's been missing within the water data space. This is not a technical thing. In the end, this is a social thing, and we've got to get over that barrier. Some of the things that we're actually working on right now, we're trying to develop a set of common tools and a set of community resources. So for things like common tools, water data glossary, water data library. So where do you actually find the data? How are those data going to be stored? Which websites are they sitting on? Before we even start pulling these into particular hubs, actually, what data actually exist? What data have been collected in the state of Illinois related to nitrogen for the past 100 years? And it turns out it's a lot, but they're sitting in all kinds of different places. Just getting our hands around where those different data sets are sitting is an enormous investment in terms of tracking that down. This is classic undergrad detective work of trying to find out where these different data sets sit. So typical community resources that we're building up as well is developing up strategies as well as best practices for how do you store data. One of the big questions that we're going to have is how are we actually going to be moving these data into the cloud, and how are we actually going to be working with cloud service providers for different types of ways that different sizes of budgets can actually accommodate. And then strategic strategies for common cataloging, connectivity, and interoperability. And there's a set of very significant decisions that the community of water data producers and users are going to need to make over the next year or two to ensure that water data is actually going to be able to talk to each other across different states as well as different sectors. That's the Internet of Water. So again, I'm the chair of the board of that, so I helped start it. Then I stepped aside when we hired an executive director, so I'd be happy to answer any questions about it probably in a couple minutes after other people go, and I'll be around for the rest of the day and happy to answer any questions that come up. Thanks.
Joaquin Esquivel was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board by Governor Jerry Brown in March 2017 and designated by Governor Gavin Newsom as chair earlier this year in February 2019. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary for Federal Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency and the Governor's Washington, D.C. office, where he facilitated the development of policy priorities between the agency, the Governor's office, the California Congressional Delegation, and federal stakeholder agencies. For more than 8 years prior to that, he worked for U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer of California, most recently as her legislative assistant covering the agriculture, Native American, water, oceans, and nutrition portfolios, in addition to being the Director of Information and Technology, which I think is really interesting for this panel, given that he, in addition to all of his state and federal policy background, has a bit of an IT background as well. So please help me welcome Joaquin.
I'll try to do my best to also further sort of highlight what we're doing here within the state. Wade provided fantastic context of really how we got to where we are in California. And I think the point that I keep emphasizing as well is just how quickly this conversation has actually happened. Whether you look at this being the 4th year of the Data Summit, or the fact that we're just a couple of years into implementation of 1755, we can really look at the last 4 years and really the drought as the context under which California has, I think, come to realize that water data is particularly going to be a key to unlocking the discussion we're trying to have around water resiliency. I want to thank Wade and Mike and all the sponsors today as well for the discussion, because I think that I feel at least very fortunate to be able to participate in a discussion that I do have some practical experience around when Mike referenced being the IT director for Senator Boxer, but certainly an office of 70 staff is not what I'm now a chair of, which is a staff of 2,000. And so for those of you that don't know the State Water Resources Control Board, a quick gloss is that we have regulatory purview over all water quality, statewide water quality in the state. We have 9 regional water quality control boards at the local level, have their water quality control programs that implement at a local level. And then we also administer all the water rights in the state, as well as recently as 2014 now, have the Division of Drinking Water over at the State Water Board. So when we talk about data, when we talk about water data, the State Water Resources Control Board is foundationally an agency that is premised off of water data. It's monitoring data, it is reporting data, and it is, I think we have somewhere near 68 data enterprise systems at this point within the organization. And so as a state agency, we struggle generally, I think, as states generally do, around how do we best leverage technology and data systems to improve our work, and in this case, a regulatory body. So the last 4 years, since the drought really, and Wade made mention of this, going to monthly reporting during the drought to aid conservation really, I think, demonstrated again the power that data has to be a feedback loop to communities. The point was made and the question raised about needing to make sure that it does connect back to people, that ultimately that data for data's sake isn't very useful, that ultimately it has to be turned into information, and that information is best empowering in a personal level, reflecting how citizens in an everyday way can make tremendous contributions, in this case conservation during the drought, to other knock-on effects. And we talked about how certainly the drought and the conservation that occurred was one of our greatest energy-saving programs ever, and wasn't contemplated to be. And so it further emphasized, and in that case, we can talk about the energy-water nexus and how better quantifying that leads to better management decisions, and what does that mean in the context of resiliency. But what we're fortunate to have is AB 1755, which allows our partner agency teams, so in this case, the State Water Resources Control Board, which, as I just mentioned, has a tremendous goal and opportunity around water data, given the tremendous data that we sit on, but that we need to be better stewards of, if I'm being completely honest. But with our partner agency at the Department of Water Resources, we've been able to better understand how it is that we can effectuate the goals of AB 1755, which is the Open Water Data Transparency Act. And we found that a key way to do so, and Wade touched upon this, was use cases, was really trying to figure out how you turn that data into information and what questions it's trying to answer. But it's also that the best structure to this, because the state board has a tremendous amount of information, water data information on the state side, as does DWR, but more importantly, so does everyone else out in the community. Water districts, whether they're irrigation or public water systems, and even energy agencies who depend on hydroelectric power and water data insofar as the management of those resources. And so a federated water data structure, though, means that what we focus on is the interoperability of those data sets. I think that, being an IT director in Senator Boxer's office, I came into, I had my own office forest, if you will, an enterprise. So I had my own domain. I was a subdomain of the Senate domain, the boxer.senate.gov domain. And there we had our BlackBerry server, our Exchange server, our file share server. We were sort of a full service entity. I had my own rack in the office there. And it was because, and we were one of the few offices as a California office that had the resources to do that. Many of the other Senate offices had been pushed off into enterprise services, so didn't have their own physical racks. We're doing cloud, starting to do cloud-based. This was back 2007 when I first joined the office. But I think the key there, though, the office really had this concern around data custody. Whose data was it? It was my data. I didn't want people to have access to my data. What happens if someone gets access to it and they're not supposed to? And so we had our own physical infrastructure there. But I think it speaks to, I think, a common problem, and that really comes to trust within who has the data, who is requiring to have it, what are you going to do with it, what will you ultimately use with and for it. And so as a regulatory entity, there is a tension there. I mean, there's a natural tension there, and there was throughout the drought around the monthly reporting requirements, and there still is a bit. Not so much, I will say, I think. But all that to say that a federated data structure allows for people to open up that data and allow it to be interoperable within sets without having to sacrifice ownership, because it really then becomes less about an entity or an organization being preoccupied with not wanting to give it to some other entity that will centralize it, but instead the centralization or the federalization of the data comes from different portals being able to see each other across, if you will, the web. And that's where the Internet of Water comes in, and some of the discussions there is it isn't just about California's data, it isn't just about the data that the State Board has or TWR has, but again, it is how we all collectively begin to have decision support tools that are built off of common data sets, and we begin to leverage what is, I think, a lot of potential that's left on the table, particularly on the management decision side. And this gets to an issue. Martin said it well. It can seem sometimes that certainly California is ahead of the game, and we're an incredibly progressive space. But this is the first year that California has had a full accounting of its previous year's diversions from its water rights holders all above a certain acreage fee. The first year. So when we talk about water data, or the criticality of it, and in the case of the State Board, the administration of its water rights system, we haven't done as good a job. And so I think it's an honest conversation that we can continue to have. Certainly AB 1755 is the structure under which we as partner agency teams continue to collaborate. We, at this point at the State Water Board, are publishing all our open water data sets on data.ca.gov, I believe it is. And the Department of Water Resources is utilizing the California Natural Resources open data platform structure to publish their data sets. And so there is our first example of how we're going to start to make this work. And really, though, I have to just thank the members of the consortium that have come together around AB 1755 implementation, because as a fee-based organization, the State Water Resources Control Board is, the work we do is all fee-based by the most part. We don't get much general fund. We go to the water districts and entities that we regulate and ask them to give us money to regulate them, which is, it may mean we always are at not an overabundance of resources to regulate. So when it comes to the tools, the analytical tools, the tools that provide and turn data into information, we don't do well to fund those sorts of systems. And so the consortium, for me, in my eyes, provides and is this critical way at which we can at least bring additional resources from NGOs, from the water sector, both public or private, everyone that's interested in this space, to really try to synthesize our resources and allow us as partner agencies on the state side to really just focus on providing the data and being very mindful and better stewards, in my mind, ultimately, of that, that data enterprise, from reporting to us as an agency, a regulatory agency, to where it lands internally to us, very specifically which server, which data, which database, how does it or doesn't it ever come back out? What are the internal front-facing tools that we use that are then based off of that data? And more importantly, how does it then get that back out to the public and allow everyone else to see what we're seeing as we regulate and as we try to accomplish what is no small task with water rights, water quality, and drinking water before the board in a regulatory sense. But I always like to say makes for a 21st century regulatory agency where we're unique in the way that we're structured currently to regulate water in the state. And I'm interested in continuing to take advantage of that unique opportunity. And it's certainly very much connected with this discussion today, and just really appreciate everyone's time and attention and further discussion amongst the panel. So thank you.
We open up an investment account and we put the money into that investment account with the hope that eventually we'll have enough money to take our family to Hawaii. So here it is, it's a year later and we're ready to go. So we go over and we tap into the computer, we log on to our investment account, and much to our appreciation, it shows that indeed we do have an investment account with this company. We look for the balance and there's nothing there. That's interesting, kind of alarming. So we call the investment company and get on the phone with them. Hey, I just logged into my investment account and I saw that I've got the account, but I wasn't able to really get any information on it. Well, sir, appreciate that. Thanks for your investment. You're absolutely right. I can verify that you've got an account with us. Okay. Thanks. I appreciate that. That's helpful. I was wondering, can you talk to me a little bit about the investment? I mean, how is it done? What do I have? Oh, thanks for asking. We agree that you're entitled to that information. And now that you've asked, I can tell you that you have about 1,000 shares of our market mutual fund. Great. Okay. Is there a reason I wasn't able to get that online when I logged in? Well, yeah, you're supposed to have access to that. Our company policy is that you have to call us to get that information. And now that you've asked for it, I can give you a little bit more information about it. What would you like to know? Okay, that's a weird policy, but fine. Listen, I'm planning for a vacation. How much is my investment worth? Oh, that's a tough one. What do you mean it's a tough one? Well, you invested in a mutual fund that has a lot of companies that we've invested in. For me to get that information to you, I'd have to talk with each of those companies about how they're doing. Hold on for a second. You said something strange. You said there was a lot of companies. How many companies have you invested in? Well, actually, I have to go to a report that we issued last year to tell you how many companies we own then, but it changes all the time, so I'm not really sure how many companies we have today. And you can start to see Hawaii might not be happening as soon as you thought. That is an extreme example, but a few years ago, I would say that was very close to the way things were in the state of water here in California. And we've been working as a community to improve that state because it isn't the kind of state that we wanted. You guys are all bought in on this already, so you see the benefits associated with having better water data and more open access to it. The final point on this slide is that I ultimately think that the vision that's been articulated today, and Martin, you did a great job of taking a look at what the broad vision would be, allows better collaboration between the entities that you see below, whether it's public and private entities working together, whether it's utilities working with research institutions, Joaquin, the regulator working with the regulated. I think that these are all relationships that actually develop and improve as a result of what we're talking about today. We're seeing incredible efforts with respect to innovation within the utilities. We're getting more data now on the condition of our systems, the nature of the programs that we run. And unfortunately, we're not able to tap into the larger community of helping us try to solve some of these problems and interpret that data to do analysis that will help us in the future in a way that comports with that vision. That's the long-term goal, but we're still trying to get there in the face of more data than we've ever had. So I'm not going to talk about all of the various benefits. Obviously, you guys understand that. Here are some of the key challenges. And I can't remember who it was earlier today. It might have been Joaquin that actually talked about the last bullet. I think it's the most important bullet on this list, which is the question of trust. We are, as utilities, producing data. We want to work with the state agencies. We want to work with research institutions, allow any member of the public to be able to have direct access to data that they should have access to. I mean, frankly, under state law, most of the data we produce is supposed to be publicly available. It is, they just have to call us to talk to us to get it. That trust gets back to when you open up a platform where you're making all of this data available, that the entity that is helping to enable that platform isn't also an entity that might come back and create policy recommendations that criticize your agency. It needs to be a trusted platform that allows for the distribution of the data, making the data truly accessible, but it's separate entities that are creating the policy recommendations and maybe making some of those valuative statements. So that's where I use this term facilitators, and Martin talked about 3 different groups. I would add data facilitators as an important piece of this, where the California Data Collaborative and the new California Water Data Consortium fall into this category of facilitators. We, through the Data Collaborative, have seen a wonderful growth of applied research through a collaboration with researchers and with water agencies and state agencies that are helping us further develop the science, to develop research, to inform our decisions. That's great. It's why we're all here. The data consortium concept that was put out by the advisory council that came out of AB 1755 is serving yet a different need. Here, when we look at that consortium, the idea is to have a safe place for state agencies, for water data users, and for utilities to work together to talk about standards for putting and making water data available, the normal data that should be publicly available, truly accessible for people to be able to see. There are many different ways that we could do that. And the idea here, this last bullet, is really important. This consortium will help make that happen, but it isn't at the same time making policy recommendations on general water policy. This is what creates that safe place for us as water utilities to say, okay, what do I need to do to get the data up online so it's machine readable, so that agencies can pull that data? It then is used for my normal public reporting and can meet all of those needs. It also goes into a portal that can allow any member of the public to access and see. And then, frankly, when I want to work with a research institution, I'm also able to say, frankly, a lot of the data that we would want you to be able to utilize is there. There might be additional things that we've chosen not to make available there for security reasons in order to protect personal information, and that's fine. But a lot of that data would already be there. That's the concept behind the consortium, to create that safe place to be able to develop those kinds of standards that allow that to happen. I am very happy to report that the consortium has now been stood up as a 501c3. We've got a number of agencies with state agency buy-in that have agreed to serve on the initial board, and also to provide funding for this, with great help from the Bechtel Foundation. Here at Metropolitan, we are participating. A number of agricultural agencies are participating. So we see this as a great opportunity to set up that next step to be able to facilitate making the open water data portal and the vision that came out of AB 1755, and frankly even broader, happen here in the state of California. With that, I'm happy to engage in additional discussion as we go through the panel. Thank you very much.
All right, last but not least, we have Chris Tull. He's a public technologist from Southern California. He helps water managers and other public servants plan and make more informed decisions under uncertainty by taking full advantage of the many data resources available to public agencies. His work involves a combination of creative data integration, data system engineering, applied R&D, and decision support tool development. He works for Argo Labs, where he serves as the project manager for the California Data Collaborative. This involves the design and management of data infrastructure to support their member utilities by ingesting, processing, and analyzing water use data from millions of Californians. He also has expertise consulting for water districts, where he designs big data solutions for handling large volumes of AMI data and advises utility staff on data analytics strategy. Please welcome Chris Tull.
seems like it wasn't too long ago that I was right in the same position. I'd like to echo Deven that it's an honor to be up here with all these great panelists. And I feel like we've gotten to hear, little bits about the Data Collaborative from different angles over the past, couple hours. So I'll be fairly brief, but I think June did a great job articulating the sort of the founding vision and the origin story. So I want to step back just a minute and talk about what happened right after the origin story. So, this new entity is birthed, and then what happens? So Patrick gives me a call, says, hey, you want to come on this trip with me? Ride this wave. And so we get there, we have this data, and so from day one, we were just rolling up our sleeves and, elbow deep in the data, in this, metered water use data from agencies. And so we started developing standards for it, started, consolidating it, developing pipelines to really automate the way that it's pulled from agencies so that, it can flow smoothly. We always have updated data. It's all, sort of interoperable. And I think one of the intentions of this panel was to talk about all the various data efforts that are underway and also sort of, delineate what makes one special, where do we fall? And I think that's one of the things that has made the Data Collaborative unique from the beginning is engaging with the technical problems and the technical solutions from the very beginning. And it's really core to what we do and the way that we operate. In terms of what we actually do, so I mentioned gathering metered water use data. That's sort of the core of where we work. We work with local water retailers, local wholesalers, and we take the data that they have, whether it's water use or rebate data or information on their marketing campaigns, for example. And we, bring it together. We make use of a lot of the great data that, Joaquin and the state boards make available, data that DWR makes available, all this great public data. You can really get a lot more value when you, combine it all together. So being able to take evapotranspiration data from, that DWR collects through the CIMIS program, or agency boundary shapefiles and monthly conservation reporting from the State Water Board. Being able to bring it all together and come up with new and unforeseen uses, I think that's a lot of the vision of what these gentlemen are articulating. And that's really where we've been working in the trenches, trying to solve the problems that local agencies face. And I'll be honest, we've had some failures in terms of, so it's very easy with technology to sort of, pick a problem and you start to solve it and then you realize that maybe you're actually solving not quite the right problem. Or the problem that you thought you should have been solving was actually this other one that you should address in a different way. So I guess that's one point I want to add, in that I think the Internet of Water and the data consortium is super valuable to have the social aspect of this, because, so like Martin said, a lot of these problems are social. Sometimes the technology is solved and it's done, and you just need to have the right people in the room talking about the problem, and it's solved more or less. But other times, I'm hesitant to get to distance too far from the technology problems, because if there's one thing that programming has taught me, it's that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a problem that is going to take you an hour and a problem that's going to take you a week. So I'd say there's value in starting to touch on the technology part early, as we convene these groups and start talking about convening all these different stakeholders to discuss the problems that they have, discuss their use cases. If we can just maybe as early on in the process, try and just prototype something, get something in front of people as early as possible and see if it works, see if you're solving the right problem, it can really save a lot of time in the long run. And I guess I'm probably going to cut off there so we have more time for discussion. I have this note to talk about the role of CADC going forward, and I think that's going to be what it has been for the last 3.5 years, which is working with local agencies and others really to develop analytics supporting water managers, facilitate applied research with connecting researchers with agencies with data, and then also community building, which is what we're doing today. So let's get on with the panel.
I want to know what you're learning outside of California that will be helpful to us in California. And I'm going to cheat and ask a second question of what you're seeing in California that you think could be shared on the outside.
Good question. Are we good? Well, clearly, or does it work? Good. All right. Clearly, North Carolina is going to be the hotbed of where the solutions come out of. So we should just start with that. I mean, I think that one of the things that we're seeing, the lessons that we are learning is every state does their water differently. And so in one sense, we're learning a lot from especially heavy groundwater dependent states similar to California. So Oklahoma, Kansas, especially the Texas groundwater districts, we're starting to see what opportunities exist there for these collaborations of districts. And so basically kind of putting the problem out to the local water managers and kind of telling them what we're going after, and then just trying to figure out how do we get traction out of those different groups. And I think that's where we're starting to learn kind of the blocking and tackling aspect of building up data requires the first step of building up trust. And I think that that's probably going to be the big thing that we're learning. One of the other things that we're learning in a couple of the southeastern states, especially on the water quality front, is if I wanted nitrogen data there'd probably 17 different metrics that people in this room would come up with as the right metric. So total nitrogen, nitrogen is nitrate. So how far are we going to go down those roads? And so what we're starting to work on a lot in the Southeast is a push-pull kind of a mechanism of getting the state agencies to be increasingly clear on what data they want and what format they want it in, and how can it be delivered, and then a push side of it of what resources do the most poorly resourced water districts or utilities need in order to meet the type of expectations that the state might be thinking of. And that's the push-pull that we've got to figure out, because we can't create a requirement if 35 water utilities in North Carolina can't meet that requirement. So we're really going out, we're driving the back roads of North Carolina, Real America, whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but the really declining population types of areas that are getting faced with, now we have to do IT as well. And we're trying to figure out what exactly do you need? Do you need a full-time IT person? We don't think so. Do you need a website or an app for the data that you're already collecting so that what you're already doing can be facilitated? And what is the minimum technology that could actually be used that we could actually pull to the state level from? So those are the types of very long-term conversations that we're having within different states at different government layers in order to really understand the scale of the problem. So, I don't know if that answered or not. But.
We'll see. We'll let the audience decide. They'll drill you later. Joaquin, I'm going to go to you next. So the state is charged with implementation of AB 1755, and by all accounts, it's going well. It's not easy. It's not perfect. It's a bit messy, but there's a really fantastic collaboration happening, and governance within the state has great cooperation. So my question is, given that, why do we need a consortium, and how can the Internet of Water help?
Yeah, I think I may have touched on this a bit, and it's really because ultimately I don't think it's not just about our data, and it is also about bringing the resources that we need to the actual the problem here. And frankly, as state agencies, we're often not well resourced to really be sort of a central hub for some of these discussions. And the consortium allows us to really have a discussion that is outside of us a bit and also better resourced. And I think that it allows for a more neutral space so that it isn't about say, maybe the state board convening a discussion just on its regulatory data, or maybe a mistrust of a regulatory entity being that convener. But we're in the room, we're partners, and we're able to have, and an important, and Deven touched on this, an important component of the consortium is that it's not a policymaking group. It's not there to set policy, to tread into any of the space that everyone is always concerned about in the data side of things, when people feel that their data will ultimately be turned around and used against them somehow. And so the consortium is that necessary entity, I think, for us to, one, have additional resources, but two, also set a table that we can continue to build the trust between all the entities around the work that we need to do. I think ultimately it touches on perhaps a point that Martin made around developing common pool resources. I think in the context for us of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, something of a missed opportunity was maybe a discussion that the state of California could have had around what does a sort of an open source platform that GSAs could bring into their agencies at lower cost. You can have it tailored, certainly. You'd have plenty of contractors there that would be able to further tailor it to their needs. But how do you invest as a state, and I think as communities, into common pool resources that everyone can then continue to use? And it does, have that effect of rising, the tide and floating everyone's boats, if you will. So I think that's where the consortium is going to be a great venue, table, discussion, and a group of folks, and really excited to continue to engage in that, while the partner teams on the agency side, the state agency side, continue to get their own wheelhouses in order. And I'm certainly interested in doing that at the state board, and have, thankfully, incredible staff that are also not just passionate, but effective at doing so.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Chris now. So the California Data Collaborative has been a leader for 3-4 years now. I guess we've established for several years. We've touched a bit on how the landscape has changed from when you launched to where you are now, but not so much from the technology side. And so I'm curious what you think is possible today that maybe wasn't 3 years ago.
From the technology side, I feel like a lot of what was possible then is or what is possible now was still possible then. People say technology moves fast, but like a lot of what we're doing, we're not using necessarily cutting edge technology. We're using, a lot of what we do is open source, it's free. A lot of it's been around for a long time, but a lot of the power comes in just applying it with the right group of people to the right problems. So I honestly, I do think what has changed is more on the people side. It's that water data is a thing now, right? It's, we've heard this several times, the 40 people to 240 or whatever, but we also have so much more, in addition to just interest, so much more support. So these other organizations, the consortium, the state board being much more open about pushing data, making that data open, the Internet of Water, all of these other groups, because this right here is an example of us all, finding the ways that we work together and where our collective, strengths are and our weaknesses. And so I think, it's not necessarily fun to be the only water data game in town. So I'm happy that we're not, because I think a lot of these other groups can do things that a lot better. They can do things better in areas that are our weaknesses, if that makes sense. So I think that's the biggest thing that's changed.
All right. Deven, you're sitting in an interesting position here because you participate in the Aspen dialogue that helped birth the Internet of Water. You've supported AB 1755 implementation through engagement with the Advisory Council. You're now serving on the board for the California Water Data Consortium. You're also a funder and a partner of the California Data Collaborative. So my question is, how do you see all these efforts fitting together? and why do we need each of them?
Can y'all hear me? Yeah. So hearing you say that, I feel like the Forrest Gump of the water data kind of effort, and it's just been kind of by happenstance, and I feel very fortunate about it. I think that the first thing that I focus on is that there's tremendous gain to be made by engaging in a process with the outcome being to try to make publicly available data truly accessible. I don't pretend to know all of the new things that will come out of that process. The analogy that I shared at the beginning with respect to financial data, we all know that 30 years ago, the amount of data and the accessibility to financial data was fundamentally different than what we see today. And we're able to do things in a completely different way. I don't know that my investment approach is any better as a result of that, but the costs did go down. The costs of trading, the costs of getting the information went down. So my expectation is that kind of outcome comes out of this. I believe that the organizations that are at the table that we're talking about, the work behind the Internet of Water, the work to establish the consortium to promulgate standards, to take a look at how making it easier for this data to be accessible, sets the platform for groups like the California Data Collaborative to then be able to use that data so that we're able to engage in research and analysis that makes us better utilities. So that's the framework for me. The other thing, I see a tremendous benefit in the following sense. As Joaquin described, we now have this data set for this past year, for the first time. As we were going through the drought sequence, I was one of the folks that was consistently getting up to the state board to paint a picture for Southern California water, to let them know how we were doing, because it didn't comport with the drought map that was being shown on a monthly basis. And the reason I had to do that was because the state board presiding over water rights in the state of California that should have all of this data at their fingertips didn't. To me, we replay that drought again in the future, and I feel like that relationship and the nature of those discussions is very different, because there is an automatic ability for the state board and the state agencies to be able to see, as a result of the investments that we made in Southern California, our water reliability picture was a little bit different. So you could envision very different outcomes going through that drought as a result of having more access to that data. So that by itself is a simple example of how I think things would be vastly improved.
All right, let's go to the audience. As I understand it, there's people with microphones or a person with a microphone out there somewhere. Over here. Do we have some questions from the audience? Come on. Yeah, there we go. I see one over here.
Good morning. I know this group has done a lot to compile the data, make it available for the public to use. But for the same data set, you can use different interpretation and reach very different conclusions. And some of those conclusions would be misleading or false. So my question for the panelists is what your visions are for the future of building the right data models and analytics to facilitate the users to make good use of the data you compiled.
I'm having a problem. I can't tell if this is on or not, but okay. Sorry. This is, I think, core to the point that I was making about trust. And it's a challenge in the sense that, we don't hide behind this. Water agencies were stealth agencies for many, many years. We appreciated being in the backdrop and being that infrastructure that people didn't see, and you weren't out in the limelight. when we're making this data available and it becomes out there for everybody to look at, for everybody to analyze, you are absolutely right. Different people are going to come to different conclusions. And the risk for us is some of those conclusions might lead us to have to change the way we do things. We might not want to. We might be driven, against that. I'm comfortable with that. I think that we've got competent management. We'll work through that. The challenge for me is not doing it, going in the other direction of trying to hoard the data, to try to force people to come to us for it in a way that makes it look like we're hiding things, does not build public trust. And so we're now at that space where technologically everybody knows you can make it happen. So then I think a rightful question is, so why aren't you letting this data get out there? What are you afraid of? I would rather be at a stage where we're putting it out there and we're engaging in that dialogue and we recognize people will do analysis, and I trust that a fair amount of that analysis will help us manage better, but some of it is going to expose some things that we're going to have to manage with. I'm okay with that.
Really appreciate that, Deven. I think, from our side, we definitely are concerned about context and data and information. As you all know, we recently passed SB 200 here in the state of California, which has established a safe and affordable fund. And when we talked about the need to establish the fund, and as we continue to talk about fulfilling the human right to water in the state of California, and we talk about 1 million people plus at this point who don't have access to clean and safe drinking water. To the general public, that can start to sound like they shouldn't trust their drinking water. Or in the case of new maximum contaminant limits, as we develop data around them, say around PFAS or PFOA, the public, it is hard for someone who isn't immersed in what the toxicological data shows or what it actually means or what is a notification level. It can mean and translate to a lot of sometimes fear, or particularly around drinking water, which people take incredibly personal. It's something we imbibe daily, and forces people to buy bottled water perhaps when they shouldn't. And so, it is really important when we talk about data and we talk about these discussions about bringing it out. What does it mean for people? How do you empower people to interpret it and not draw the wrong conclusions? And it's something that we struggle with, obviously, on the regulatory side in the Division of Drinking Water, because people do want to know. And it quickly can, again, it can be hard to interpret, I think, for some folks, let alone myself as well. How to properly take all of it into context, particularly when it comes to public health. And now as a public health agency, that does ring true. So I think it is central and it is, important. But to Devin's point as well, I don't think the reaction should be, well, we have to control that before you let the data go out. I think that the ability, the consciousness level, the maturity of us as Californians, as everyday Californians, to understand and process that information and figure out what it means for them, I think it's there. And we're not going to have that conversation if we don't kind of have a spirit of leaning toward of letting the data out, but being mindful of the continual need for context and information or education, rather, that is, on what it means for folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment there also. So I think in some regards, it's actually very desirable to have, multiple results coming from, analyzing a single data set, because, oftentimes there's no true way to look at the data. So if you are trying different methods, what this group says this from the same data, this group says this, maybe you shouldn't trust one of them, or you shouldn't trust either of them, right? So it can be valuable to have some skepticism. And I think, so we don't necessarily want to discourage that. But one way that you can sort of evolve to a next step is moving a bit beyond. So you start thinking about open data, you can also start moving towards open standards for analysis. So maybe there's no right method, and different methods give slightly different results. But if you can get the community to align on one way of doing things that, maybe it's not perfect, but it's what everyone accepts as the standard way to do things, then you can build off of that. So a good example of this is the Caltrack standard that's used by the energy industry to analyze the energy saved from demand management measures. So, they convened a bunch of stakeholder work groups, developed a method to estimate energy savings, and they all sort of said, okay, it's not perfect, but this is the method that we're going to use. So anyone who's wants to participate in pay-for-performance programs, use this method to calculate energy savings. And so you sort of resolve some of the ambiguity and get people working together.
Let's see if we have another question. I know I saw more hands. Oh boy, there's quite a few. Let's go right over here. Yes, the gentleman right there.
Thank you for taking my question. The Internet of Things is a pretty well-established platform in GIS, and that's led to like smart city infrastructure and that kind of thing. I was wondering if that model or that framework has been considered in taking this forward technologically.
Yes. But I think just to echo what's been said, I really like what Chris said. The technology's been around a while, but actually deploying that technology on data has not been. And I think that we're at such a baby step level. The people who are in the sensor community, some of which may be in this room, I think are chomping at their bits for the stream of data that's coming out of these sensors to be put into this broader context that can then be digested and synthesized into information related to public health. I think the transformation is possible, but it depends on this unbelievably mundane step of getting public water data interoperable. And that I just feel like maybe, and I think it's going to happen very fast in California and very slowly in some other states, but I think that this is a necessary, painful step that we have to go through before we get to the Internet of Things type of step.
Yeah, I think it's been said before, but you look at the energy sector or even transportation and other places where and just city management, whatever. These things have been happening, and I appreciate Deven also the example on the financial side, because financial regulatory technology is what is driving so much of the economy around how you just do better. And as a regulatory agency on the water quality, water rights, and drinking water side, trying to sort of crack that nut when it comes to how do we become a 21st century regulatory agency that is also then automatically getting data. Our electronic, our environmental laboratory accreditation program, ELAP, that is a program, as an example, that is all data, is all submitted electronically to us from the labs, all the labs in California. When Deven or any other public water agency goes and their water gets tested, it all just dumps straight into ELAP. So what are those data systems? What are those ways that we can start to really leverage out, for me at least, the question is as a regulatory entity, and really take those lessons from the financial industry, from energy, from the discussion happening around city management and say, yes, let's apply, but it's not too easy.
I've seen Martha here in the middle of the room, the furthest away from microphones, patiently trying to ask a question. So I wonder if we could bring someone over to the middle section.
I want to focus for a moment on the common pool resource opportunity that's related to the Internet of Water. So we've been talking a lot about the data coming up and how it helps to inform better decision making, particularly at the state level, looking across the country at the state level. What are the examples of some of the common pool resources that can be developed that then come back and help our water utilities manage water better? And the one I was thinking about as you guys were talking was certainly some of the aerial imaging that we need that helps us see landscapes and relationships between all the data sets. But I'm sure there's other types as well. But what are you seeing across the country? And then if anybody else wants to add to it. Thank you.
It's a really good question. I'd point you to Kyle. I don't know if Kyle is here. He skipped out on me. So Kyle, find him for sure. Look for the name tag Kyle. So he's working on a lot of these. I would almost invert it and say what would be most useful to both state water managers as well as to the public. The one that has really captivated me has just been, I should be able to Google whether my water is drinkable when I get to work in the morning. To me, it's just like, let's just start at a very simple question that every community in the United States should be able to answer. And that's kind of the one that just is kind of the drumbeat for me in the background. And if we can start with that one, that's a common pool resource of, so how do we actually get the data so that, again, the 35 smallest utilities in North Carolina can provide the data and it can be available. The state of North Carolina should have that app available, and the data that's already being collected by the utilities should be able to go into that, populate that, and it should be super clear so that when I drink the water in the morning at my house and I go to another utility for work, I should be able to look at both of those first thing in the morning. But I would invert it of, what do you want to know about your public water? And let's build common resources around those questions that are so blatantly obvious. We have calorie counts at Chick-fil-A. We have calorie counts on, if you look at, I have more information about a can of soda than I do about the water that I drink and bathe in every day. And I just think that that's unacceptable for the United States.
Just quickly, one project that I would just flag is OpenET. It's an open evapotranspiration project that includes, I think it's like Google and EDF and the Environmental Defense Fund and a whole NASA. It's a whole host of folks that is developing a common pool resource, a synthesis of different, back to the issue of different ways of measuring. There's certainly different ways of measuring ET from remote sensing data, but it's going to try to synthesize all those and provide for free then a tool that ag users, water managers, whatever it may be, can try to kind of better balance that side of the equation when it comes to what is actually happening to water in a watershed on the ET side of things. Where is it going? Where is its ultimate fate? And that's a huge component, obviously, of water management writ large, and can be a proxy, as we know, for water use, say, in a crop. If you know what its ET rate is, then you know what your consumptive use for that crop on that land is. So that's kind of an exciting one, and being used in, I think, the Midwest, and where, we're very fortunate, obviously, in the state that we most of our waters are within our state. We share a bit of our boundary, obviously, with the Klamath Basin in the north, with Oregon, and we get a lot of water off the Colorado River Basin, but by and large. But many other states obviously have these really complicated transboundary water challenges, and these common pool resource tools, I think, are going to be really important to sort of driving a lot of discussions there.
I don't want to ignore this side of the room over here, just because I have an obstructed view from the podium. So I do see a question over there.
Hi, thanks for being here and for having us. And my question is, how is the state of outreach to engage all the data producers to share the data? And how are you currently helping or guiding those small agencies that maybe don't have all the resources to collect that data and put it on this big hub that you guys are creating? Thank you.
Well, on? Yes? No? No? Yes? Can you hear me? Okay. I think that there is a pitch that still has to be made to water agencies with respect to direct engagement in this process. Some are, but for many of the small agencies, there's probably a question about what is the gain for me in terms of working at some cost to make this data more available or accessible as part of this process. So I think one of the efforts that's being undertaken both at a state level, the California Data Collaborative is working in this regard, and the consortium is also focusing on is this a tool to streamline reporting and make the reporting requirements for agencies across the board, including very small ones, easier to comply with? If you promulgate standards and say, well, if you're able to put your data up and make it machine readable and accessible, that the state will pull that data and then it will meet many of these reporting requirements automatically, that is a use case and a potential benefit to agencies that should make it a little bit easier. I think that once we get over the hump on that, you're going to see agencies across the board saying, okay, I see the value in this, let's engage.